All right, well, I'm sure we'll have a few stragglers coming in here, but we'll get started. Value everyone's time. So we don't want to leave you waiting too long. My name's Troy Beaver with HalenHardy. We have Karen Hamill on here who will be doing another great webinar for us today. A few things before we get started, just housekeeping items. I'll do a quick rundown on what it is we do at HalenHardy, and then we'll let Karen jump in. First things first, if you have any questions throughout the course of the webinar, go ahead and just throw them in the chat, and we'll address them all at the end. This is also streaming live on our YouTube page. So for whatever reason, if you do have any technical issues with Teams, which tends to happen, feel free to go onto our YouTube page. That link is in the chat as well. If you don't have that link, just type HalenHardy into YouTube and you will see this streaming live there. Finally, if you would like a certificate following the webinar, we will be sending out an email. Just click the link in the email and we will get a certificate over to you for this. Again, thanks to everyone for attending. Good morning, good afternoon. I know we have a few attendees overseas who it's probably their afternoon, evening. So thanks for attending. Real quick before Karen jumps in, just I know we have a lot of people on here who know what it is we do at HalenHardy and some folks that probably don't know anything about us. So thanks for attending for the first time. HalenHardy, we are a manufacturer developer of products and offering services based around what we like to say, simplifying spill and sediment control. We focus on 4 core areas at HalenHardy. That's spill cleanup and containment in the outdoors. That's anything from land-based spills in wet, rainy conditions to containing and cleaning up spills on water, as well as products for putting under persistent equipment leaks in the outdoors. We also focus on filtering oily sheen from stormwater inside of secondary containment structures, as well as filtering sheen, sediment, and other contaminants from stormwater runoff. That's anywhere from ditches and outfalls to around storm drains. And we also, our 4th area, core area, is dewatering. So pumping out contaminants from different areas and filtering those contaminants out. If you have any questions on that stuff, feel free to throw them in the chat. If you'd like to chat further, my contact info will be at the end of the presentation, so you can grab that there. With that, I will let Karen hop into another great webinar. So thank you all.
Thanks, Troy. Pleasure to be here today, looking at a new regulation that EPA came out with and finalized and made effective in May, and looking at whether or not it applies to your facility. And even if it doesn't apply to your facility, a lot of the things that the EPA put into this regulation are still really good things that can help enhance any plans that you may have at your facility for spill response. Anytime that a hazardous material, whether that is an oil, whether it is a corrosive material, whatever that hazardous material is that could get into the environment and could have a chance to get into the environment, even if this rule doesn't specifically apply to you, some of those new principles and some of the new things that they have put into this rule could really enhance your plan and make it stronger, so that when the inevitable does happen, when that spill does occur, your facility is better prepared and your people are better prepared to handle that and to handle it no matter what the conditions are. So looking at some of the main criteria specifically for this spill, or for this regulation is specifically applicable to facilities that are within 1/2 mile of navigable waters. Now, that could be a property line, but most often it's a conveyance. And this is a term that the EPA has added that is anything that basically discharges. So this might be a pipe, this could be a ditch, it could be an outflow, whatever it is that leads from your facility and is getting to a navigable waterway. So when we think about our property line, we could be 3 or 4 miles from that navigable water, but if there is a pipeway, a channel, a ditch, whatever that leads to that is actually and ends up in the water, in that navigable waterway, you could have 0 miles from that navigable water. So that's something new that we need to look at, whether you're mapping, whether you're coordinating, if you are the person in charge of writing the plan or updating your plans. If this applies to you, that first criteria, make sure you're aware of those conveyances and where they are. So where does that storm drain lead? Where does that ditch go? Are those conveyances that could put you into the need to comply with this regulation? The second one is looking at the list of substances that the EPA has designated for this, and there are 296 of them. So this is something, this rule in some ways parallels the SPCC regulation in many ways in the need to be ready for a spill, the need to have equipment available for a spill, but specifically it applies to the 296 Clean Water Act hazardous substances, and these are listed at 40 CFR 116. And actually at the end of the presentation, when we send out materials for this, all of this will be listed and give you a better reference so that you can actually go check those out. I know it's kind of hard to keep track of all the things that we may talk about at one time, but that list again is at 40 CFR 116, and it lists different hazardous substances. And if you're familiar with EPA regulations, they also give you threshold quantities for planning. So this is the amount that they have determined in pounds that is going to cause some kind of an effect in the environment. So it could kill fish, it could affect water quality, whatever that may be, whatever harm it may do. They've determined that threshold that is an unreasonable limit for them. And it could be as small as 1 pound. Sometimes it's 1,000 pounds. But whatever that may happen to be, they've determined that for this regulation, if you've got that hazardous substance at 1,000 times the listed quantity, this rule is up, and you're within a half a mile of those waterways, this rule is applicable for you. So when we look at that 1,000, it does kind of seem like a lot. Wow, 1,000 times the threshold quantity. That can seem like a lot, and you may never reach it. But if you've got something that has a reportable quantity of 1 pound, and let's say it's a liquid and its specific gravity is similar to water, really you're looking at about 250 gallons. So that kind of helps, that helped me to put into perspective of, I don't have to have an entire above ground storage tank of this necessarily. If I've got something that is pretty nasty and is going to do a lot of damage, one tote might be all that is required for me to fall under regulation for this. So look at that list, make sure that if you've got something on it, you know how much you store, and determine whether or not it is within that 1,000 pounds of that threshold quantity. And one thing that is different from the SPCC regulation is that they're looking at the actual pounds that you're storing, not the container capacity. If you remember with the SPCC regulation, you could have an above ground storage tank that holds 20,000 gallons, but maybe you only keep 5,000 gallons on site. It was the capacity that triggered the regulation, not the actual storage. In this one, it's different. It's the actual amount that you're storing. So a little more in line with the RCRA regulations, where you're looking at what you actually got on site, not the capacity of the container. So keep that in mind as you're calculating that if you do have tanks of this or you do have large quantities of it, the actual amount that you're keeping on site is what's going to be the trigger for this. And the third criteria is that you need to meet this substantial harm. And what this is, there are 4 different criteria. The first is that whatever this hazmat is going to cause injury to fish. And I've kind of already mentioned that when the EPA was determining those threshold quantities, those threshold quantities are what they determined could be detrimental to that aquatic life in the environment. So pretty much if you've met the other 2, you're probably going to injure fish if it does get into a waterway. Or it could the second criteria for substantial harm, if you aren't going to injure fish, is that it could impact a public water system. And this one is very broadly interpreted. So this could be something where it causes the color of the water to be different. It causes the taste to be different. It causes the smell to be different. So even if it's not going to physically harm a person, if it causes differences in color, differences in any of those things that I mentioned, that is enough for it to meet that substantial harm criteria. The third one is that it is going to injure a public receptor. And public receptors are pretty much any areas that the public would frequent. So this could be a park, it could be a school, it could be a recreational area, anything that the public would go to routinely. If it would have an effect on that, so if you would have to evacuate that area, if you would have to close that area for the public, that would be an injury to that public receptor. So again, very broadly interpreted, depends on what you may be impacting the water with. But if it would cause any kind of disruption there, that would meet that substantial harm criteria. And the fourth is whether or not you've had a reportable discharge history. So this is actually going back 5 years and looking at any discharges that you have had that are reportable. Now, this does not, your NPDES permitted discharge do not fall under this. So this is going to be any unintended, any intentional, any storm-related discharge that you had that was not within that permit. So if any of those four things are met and you meet the other two criteria, then you are subject to this regulation and you will need to either enhance a plan that you already have or begin a new facility response plan that meets the requirements of this role. And of course, there's the caveat for the regional administrator. Maybe you don't meet those three criteria, but the regional administrator determines that you have the potential to cause substantial harm. They can actually overrule those three criteria and require your facility to have a plan. Now, this is new, and when other roles have come out, they've had a similar clause in them. We don't see it enacted very often, but there are times when that regional administrator maybe is a little more stringent. Maybe you're near a very pristine trout stream and they require everybody to be a little more stringent in that area. But that regional administrator can require your facility to have this new facility response plan. Now, there's a petition process and other things that you can go through, but do know that that caveat, just like in other roles, is in there. And also, there is a potential for the public to petition to require your facility to have a plan. So if, let's say, your facility has had a really bad history of spills and has caused a lot of damage in the area, the public could petition to require your facility to meet these new planning requirements. So just keep that in the back of your mind as well. And as I mentioned, even if you're not required, take a look at some of the things that are required in this plan and see if your facility is truly prepared for them. Couple of exemptions, and most of these apply to facilities that are already regulated under another regulation. So we know that the DOT has very extensive regulations for vessels and seacraft that are carrying hazardous materials. They feel that the EPA felt that those were stringent enough that they didn't need to be burdened by creating another facility response plan that probably would be redundant to what they already have. Of course, anything in the waters is subject to the Coast Guard regulations as well, so no need to double dip there. Underground storage tanks are very heavily regulated. They've got a lot of checks and balances in place and do have planning requirements for incidental and worst case spills. So not another need to pile on there. TSDFs are transportation, storage, and disposal facilities. These are companies or organizations that are dealing with hazardous waste every day, very heavily regulated under RCRA, and very prone to having those plans already enacted and already able to be rolled out when they're needed. And large quantity generators. When RCRA revised the regulations a few years ago, the large quantity generators fell subject to a lot of those TSDF regulations and a lot of those planning requirements. So for facilities that do meet the other criteria, if they're already regulated under these other regulations, they may not need to go full force into having that new facility response plan because it's already covered within those other bodies. And again, that note that if you do have an NPDES permit and you do have those legal discharges that you're making, those are not within the realm of this, and they don't meet the planning requirements for this particular regulation. So what are we looking at in facility response plans? These are a lot of things should be familiar to you already. A lot of the things that you're already doing, maybe for other regulations, or maybe just as a good steward of the environment, you've already got a facility response plan in place that details those things that your facility is going to do when there is an unanticipated event. So one of the new things in it is what they're calling substantial harm criteria. And this is in Appendix A of the rule. And the rule again is at 40 CFR 118, not to be confused with the list of chemicals at 116. But the substantial harm criteria is basically a checklist that the EPA has come up with. And you need to include this as part of your plan. And essentially, it is just a way to declare that the facility has gone through those different criteria of substantial harm. So this was one that it could injure fish, it could impact the public waterway or the public water system, impact those public receptors, or you have the discharge history. And essentially, you are declaring that either you meet one of those criteria or you don't meet one of those criteria. So for a facility that may be kind of near that borderline, this is a way for you to verify that you've done your diligence and you don't meet the criteria to need this plan. Or this is kind of the reason why you are putting this plan into place. And this needs to be kept with your plan, and it needs to be signed by somebody in an official capacity at your facility. That could be the environmental coordinator, it could be the facility owner, but basically you want to have that paper chain saying that you are aware of this criteria and this is why this plan is being put into place. There's also a new requirement that when you're developing your worst case scenario, you need to model that. And so what modeling is looking at maps, looking at the topography of your area, looking at your discharge points, looking at the receiving waters, and determining how far that pollution could go. So if it gets into water, how long is it going to take? How much water is needed before it's diluted to a point where it's no longer hazardous? Or am I going to need to pump out that whole lake? What are those criteria? What does that modeling look like? If it's going to go through, if it's an air pollutant and it's going to go through the city, how many people am I going to have to evacuate? What does that modeling look like? Not only on an average, clear, nice, beautiful day, but during your worst case scenario when weather is concerned. So are you prone to tornadoes? What if this happens during a tornado? What if this happens as the result of an earthquake? What if you're prone to hurricanes? Can drought affect it? Can permafrost melting in Alaska affect it if you're in Alaska? What are those other criteria that are really beyond your control? What are those weather events that if your worst case scenario discharge happens, if you lose an entire tank of this, an entire tote of this, whatever that case may be, when that happens during that bad weather event or during that natural disaster kind of event, how is that going to affect your planning? How does that change the conditions of what you're going to do to respond? And when the EPA defined adverse weather, a lot of people wanted them to list all of their criteria. So they wanted the EPA to list tornadoes, hurricanes, floods, whatever those things may be. But they left that definition very broad because there are things that happen regionally that affect one region and not another. And they wanted to be sure that they covered all of those possible scenarios. So what are those things within your facility that might affect your facility? And they could be different. If you are representing somebody at a headquarters, maybe your area is prone to flooding, but in another area, they're prone to droughts. And if they're prone to droughts, are they going to be able to maybe get the water that they need if they need to put out a fire that is a result of a discharge? So what are those things that happen regionally? and be aware of those, and be aware that they are likely different throughout the nation, and throughout the different areas that a headquarters may represent. But that modeling needs to look at whatever that scenario is with that worst weather condition. And that's something new within this requirement. We've heard worst case scenario for a long time. That's something that even when I was doing this 30 years ago, it was a term that I was familiar with. And it was always, okay, it's the biggest tank, it's the biggest tote, it's the biggest drum, it's the biggest container that I have. That's going to be my worst case scenario. But I know as a young planner, I never really considered weather in addition to that. But now that I've got 30 years into it, I know that quite often that worst case scenario, or that spill, even if it's not a worst case scenario, that event, that incident usually happens when it's cold, when it's wet, when something is happening that makes it not a nice, perfect day for us to be out and cleaning something up. So it was nice that they added this in here to make us think about those things and plan for those things. The next one is that it needs to be, your plan needs to be consistent with the NCP. NCP is the National Oil and Hazardous Substance Pollution Contingency Plan. So this is the plan that FEMA, Department of Homeland Security, and all the federal agencies have put together as their contingency plan and the way that they are going to respond. So basically it lays out, oh, sorry, I went too far there. It lays out the plans for how they are going to help with a response if federal agencies are going to come help you with whatever your response may be. So if you've had that worst day, you've exhausted all of your resources, local, state resources have been exhausted, and the federal agencies are going to come play, this is their playbook of how they're going to take care of the incident. So when we're looking at a consistency, it's, are our plans adequate? Do we have resources available? Do we know where we're going to get those resources? Do we know how to interact with these agencies to get the support that we need to do the job that we need to do? So when we're looking at that, this is something that has always been intended, but it is specifically spelled out in this regulation that your plan needs to be consistent with that. And that is at 40 CFR 300, and that will be in the information that we give you at the end as well for your reference. So take a look at that regulation and what the requirements are for that. A lot of it has to do with coordinating. So looking at how we are interacting with those local resources that we do have. And we also need, with this, you need to have a signature as well, saying that somebody has looked at this and determined that it is consistent with that national contingency plan. Another new requirement is that your facility must have a qualified individual. And a qualified individual is somebody who has the training and the knowledge to get those first initial steps of a spill response in order. So this is the person who is going to be coordinating with not only your facility personnel who are trained to help clean up a spill, but they could be coordinating with your local resources, your local fire department, your local hazmat team, your contracted agencies, if you have somebody contracted to help clean up spills. And specifically, this person is required to have HAZWOPER training. So that's something new that they're requiring with this regulation, because they've determined that if you're having your worst case scenario spill, and if it's going to reach water, that meets the definition of an emergency. And therefore that person does need to have that HAZWOPER high level training. So this is a 40 or even an 80-hour training that this person needs to take and then maintain each year so that they are ready and able to respond. And one of the reasons for this is that this role is really emphasizing that they want to shift the burden onto the facilities and not to have those public resources as the principal means of response. So too often they're finding facilities that they do have that worst case scenario spill, they've got that discharge, and they're like, oh, well, we always plan to have a contractor come in, so we've never trained our people to do that. Well, it may take an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours for that contractor to get there. In the meantime, that often means that the local hazmat team, the local fire department has to respond until that contractor can get there. So this is a way to kind of bridge that gap and put that onus back on the facility to have that person who knows what they're doing and can get those things started until those other resources are available. And of course, within the facility plan, you need the facility's information. Who owns the facility? Where is it located? Do I have a map to get in and out of there? And also, what is the EPA identification number? So that as people are looking at this, as a regulator is looking at this, they can identify that facility and they know that it's this particular facility and not another one, because sometimes addresses can get a little fudgy. So having that information within the plan just helps to identify it as your plan and not somebody else's. The hazard evaluations section, this is again nothing new. This is something that we do pretty much for any plan that we're creating. If we're creating a plan to respond to something, it's because we have determined that there is a hazard somewhere. So what is the hazard for your facility? What are the chemicals that are being stored? Where are they being stored? How are they being stored? And one thing that they threw into this was when you're evaluating your hazards, you need to also evaluate the types of containers that they're in. So are they in drums? Are they in totes? Are they in a tank that's 50 years old and could fail just based on its age? That's all part of the hazard evaluation now. And this is something that the EPA is looking to develop more tools to assist facilities so that they can perform that hazard evaluation well, so that they know where their endpoints are, so they know how far a stream travels, so that they know what public receptors are there. Are there schools? Are there hospitals? Are there healthcare facilities? Are there whatever those things may be? Are there parks? Are there recreational areas? What are those things so that you are truly prepared to handle whatever that situation may be if there is that worst case scenario discharge? And again, looking at that discharge history. And the reason for this is if you have had the misfortune of having a spill before, you kind of have that history and that kind of that lagging indicator to know that, okay, when this happened before, this was the result. So in order to not have that happen again, we need to do X, Y, and Z. But having that discharge history and knowing what happened in the past can help you model what could happen in the future if you aren't able to take those preventative actions. Any contracts that you may have. And the reason that they're asking for this is that quite often when there is a large scale disaster, for example, flooding or a hurricane or tornado, people can incorrectly assume that they will be able to get local resources that may not be available to them in that large impact disaster. Now, if it's just your facility that has been impacted and it's that discharge that happened because a tank failed or whatever, you may be able to get backhoes. You may be able to get booms. You may be able to get the hazmat team to be there. But in the event of a large scale disaster during a major impact to the whole community, you may not be able to get those resources that you rely on in other times. So what are those contracts that you have in place? Do you have a contract with an outside hazmat team? Do you have a contract with the local trash hauler? Do you have a contract with the local farmer who happens to have a lot of farm equipment that you may be able to use? What are those things and what are those agreements to assure that you've got exactly what you think you do when that time comes that you need it? And they also threw in here that whatever your response capabilities are, they need to have a firefighting capability. And that was something that was very new because sometimes it's not often, but there are hazmat response teams that solely respond to a hazardous material spill, and they don't have those firefighting capabilities. But because there are so many hazardous materials in their listing that are flammable, they wanted to make sure that when you are contracting those outside responders, that they do have the ability to fight a fire and have the capability to fight that fire. So do they have the water? Do they have the proper hookups? Whatever those things may be, they want to make sure that, again, putting that onus back on the facility to have those capabilities instead of relying on those public resources. Notifications list. This is both internal and external. So are there ways to contact all of your employees? Do you have that list set up so that you can account for everyone? And also, do you have your notifications at the local, state, and federal levels? A lot of different municipalities have different requirements for notifications. And this is just a way to keep track of all of those. Make sure that you do have all of the numbers for everybody that you would need to contact in the event of an emergency. They also threw in their notifications for the public. And the FEMA has this great system called IPAWS. IPAWS stands for Integrated Public Alert and Warning System. And they actually have a really great course that you can take for free that shows you how to use that system. And essentially, this system can map out an area and determine who all needs to be contacted. So this is something you may be familiar with it if you get a notice from your local water authority telling you that they're pumping hydrants or something in your area. This is just a way to alert the public that something has happened and they need to be aware of it. Very short text form that says, okay, here's what's happened, here's what we need you to do. But it's just a way to alert the public. And that's something that you can integrate into your plans so that you can make those notifications quickly. Again, putting that power back into your hands as opposed to requiring a public notification of that. Having evacuation plans. Again, this is something for your facility as well as the community. If you do need to evacuate the community, where are they going to go and how are they going to get there? Having that information readily available helps whoever you may need to communicate it with to do that quickly. So you could give this information to the news media, the print media, the local radio station, whoever may need to communicate that or help communicate that for you would have that information readily available. Defining personnel roles and responsibilities. This is something that we've seen in a lot of different roles, and just who is going to do what and when are they going to do it? Who's going to stay and turn off the valve? Who is going to contain the spill? Who is going to control the spill? Who's going to work with the other contractors? Who's our liaison to the local authorities? Who's our liaison within the incident command system? What are those roles and who is going to do it? And who's the backup for them? Because we all know people take vacations, people move on. So how much redundancy do we have there? And is that listed within our plan so that we know that all the roles and responsibilities are covered if we do have the need for that quick response? And response capabilities. This was one that has always been intended, but it's specifically spelled out in this role that if you have personnel and you have equipment, what are the people able to do? So have they been HAZWOPER trained? To what level have they been trained? Have they maintained their certification by doing their annual refresher each year? If I'm relying on the local fire department, what's their response time? How soon can they get here? What equipment do I have on site? So this could be anything from having absorbents on hand, having booms to put in the water. This could be heavy equipment, so earth moving equipment. This could be whatever you've got on site. What is that equipment and what is it able to do? How often do I need to look at renewing that equipment? How often do I need to look at any contracts that I may have? Just that TAC list of everything that I've got on site ready to go in the event of a spill. And what is the information on that equipment? How old is it? How often do I inspect it? And this was something that I thought was a lot more thorough than a lot of other roles, because it's one thing to list that I've got 10 spill kits and 14 backhoes and 3 ATVs, but do I have gasoline for them? When was the last time that I had that ATV overhauled? When was, it kind of made me think a little more in depth about that equipment that I may have on site and whether or not it is truly response ready. And keeping track of it is also something that you want to do, and have those records and keep those records for at least 5 years, because they are something that show that diligence to having that equipment and having it ready to go. The next thing is having an emergency detection system. So this could be something as simple as having your personnel check secondary containment systems every day. Or it could be having an alarm in your secondary containment system. It might be having a level detector within your tanks. Whatever those things are that can tell you that something is not right. And again, it doesn't have to be an alarm. It can be an alarm. It can be an inspection, or it can be just a visual gauge that happens to be there. Whatever that is, what is the way that you are going to, as a facility, determine that something has been released, or that something has the potential to be released? Whether it's an alarm, an inspection, whatever that may be, just have that listing within your plan. The next one is to have containment. And this can be a portable system. This could be a permanent system. But what is the way that you are going to capture anything that is discharged? So in this picture, if it discharges from one of those tanks, it's going to be collected within those red orange berms that you see there. If it is a spill that happens outside, maybe it's absorbents and booms or earthen materials that you're going to use to make a pole out of it. What are you going to use for containment, and how are you going to capture anything that is discharged? And they also specify within this rule that you need to be able to include firefighting foam and any runoff from firefighting activities. So that's something that we've heard a lot about firefighting foam lately, and the problems that it's causing in the environment. And they actually specifically wrote it into this rule that you need to be able to contain and control that as well, and not just let it get into the water with everything else. A new thing within this rule is looking at timeliness of your response. And so they have specific requirements for what you're going to do within the first hour after a discharge, and what you're going to do within 2 hours. So within an hour, they expect you to do these activities that I have listed here. So they expect you to notify your personnel, notify the public if the public has been impacted. Mobilize your personnel. So get your people ready to do what you need to do. Identify the extent of the incident. So have I spilled a gallon? Have I spilled 30 gallons, 300 gallons? What is that, and where is it going to go? Has it already gotten to the water? If it's gotten to the water, how many people is it going to impact? Do I need to set up shelters because people don't have fresh water in their house? What is that extent? And it may be something that is still happening or still formulating, but you need to kind of start thinking about that already. Have you coordinated with your SRO? SRO is Spill Response Organization. So this could be an outside contractor. This could be a local hazmat team. Maybe it's your facility personnel. Have you made those notifications? Are people en route to help you respond? And do you need to evacuate anyone? Do you need, especially if you've got those public receptors, if you've got those vulnerable populations within the area, do you need to start making preparations to get them out? And within 2 hours, you need to be doing those things. So you need to actually be taking some kind of active motion, some kind of activity to start mitigating that spill, stopping it, confining it, containing it, absorbing it, whatever those actions may be. Those things need to be in place and happening within 2 hours. And that's, again, something that has long been a standard. We've often heard that response teams need to be there within 2 hours, or we need to be doing something within 2 hours. But this specifically requires you to look at those things and have your plans in place, ready to go, so that those things are actually happening within that 2-hour time frame. And the next thing is to, of course, have training and exercises. How are you going to train your people? Where are you going to train your people? And again, looking at this, because the EPA feels that anytime that you're getting these hazardous materials, if you meet that criteria to be part of this role, it is going to be an emergency response. So having your facility personnel trained to that HAZWOP, to the applicable HAZWOPER standards is going to be part of this. So not only that qualified individual, but any of the other people who are responding need to have that level of training. And they also noted that if you have volunteer responders, so this could be maybe your local fire department or your local any other hazmat, any other teams that may be there, maybe a CERT team, a community emergency response team, whoever those volunteers are, if they're going to be helping with this response to something that meets this criteria, they do need to have that level of training. And of course, with the training, we also need to exercise those plans. Make sure that what we have in place, the procedures that we have outlined, are actually going to work. And our people have had enough experience with them that they know how they work and they know their role and they know how to get to what they need to do quickly and effectively. Self-inspections. This is just keeping records of what you've got on site. So keeping records of that personnel training, keeping records of what equipment you've got on site, when it was last inspected, keeping records of any personal protective equipment that you've got, whether or not it needs to be renewed or refreshed. We all know that stuff doesn't last forever. Whatever it may, and even with equipment, we know that equipment doesn't last forever, but inspecting it on a regular basis, whatever that means to you. So that could be monthly, it could be every 6 months, it might be annually for some things. But whatever that record is, keeping that checklist with your plan shows that due diligence that you are ready and you're maintaining that readiness for response whenever it may need to happen. And again, that testing, training, and drills. And this specifically is required for the facility. And also these drills that you're conducting, they should be in coordination with those other local resources that you may come to rely upon. So this is something where the facility needs to make that invitation to maybe the local emergency planning committee or the local firefighters, the local hazmat team, the local hospital, the local EMS department, if you have potential for mass casualties. Having all of those different players who will need to assist you involved with your drills, or at least making the invitation saying, hey, we're having a drill on this day. We hope that you can attend, and documenting that is important for this role because they want you to have that coordination and to make sure that the people that you're not meeting those people for the first time on that worst case day that you're having, on that worst event that you're happening. And that's something that I have found to be true through the years, is that it has been really great to know those responders and to know those people before that bad event happens. I worked at a facility that unfortunately had a very bad fire that destroyed a big warehouse. And when those responders came, I already knew those people. I knew the firefighters. I knew the police chief. I knew the different people who had come to assist us with that very bad incident. And that was great because I already knew their capabilities. I knew their names, and you really can't put a price on that when you're having that really bad day, to actually know those people and to be able to trust their abilities and their capability to help you through that response. And this is a new requirement as well. It seems a little redundant because you're making this big facility response plan, but you need to have an action plan that is separate from the binder. And basically, if you want to think about it, this is kind of the Cliff Notes version of what you're going to do. So this is going to have things that you're going to do within the first hours. We talked about having those notifications made and starting to assemble your team within the first hour, and then taking those actions within 2 hours. This is kind of that brief outline of, okay, we're going to confine the spill here. We're going to close these valves. We're going to put out the booms here. What are we going to do? And just kind of outlining that, again, as that quick Cliff Note version that just allows anybody to quickly ascertain, without getting into all the thick of all the plans that you have, what's going to happen. And this is something that possibly that your qualified individual would have, maybe something for your facility owner to keep a hold of, definitely something that you want to give to the local first responders who are helping you within that incident, so that they've all got access to that, and we're all on the same page, playing from the same book. So when do we need to change our plans? Plans need to be reviewed every 5 years, or when something at your facility changes. Maybe you get new tanks in, maybe you no longer have a big quantity of something, maybe you've doubled your production, good for you, and now you need to plan for things differently because you've got twice as much as what you've had before. Maybe you change contractors, spill response contractors. Maybe your local hazmat team has a change. Whatever those changes are, you need to reflect those in your plan within 60 days. So this is just making sure that you keep that plan as a living document, that you're aware of what you've got on site, what changes you've got on site, and how they would impact a potential discharge that could occur. Again, reviewing that every 5 years, reviewing it anytime you've added or removed substances. And also when you do have those changes, there's a specific requirement to resubmit those to the regional administrator for approval. So all of these plans are going to go there. They're going to be reviewed by that regional administrator who's going to look to make sure that they are consistent with the national contingency plan, that you've got those resources available, the personnel are available, that you've got that qualified individual, you're doing training. And they're going to look at that every 5 years to make sure that that plan is still resilient and that you are still able to respond when you need to. And finally, annual coordination. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but this plan really, really lays out the need to respond with those local authorities and possibly state or regional authorities. So do you have a regional task force that you deal with? Do you have that local emergency planning committee, local hazmat team, the local hospitals? Is everybody who you look to for help going to be able to respond? Are they aware of your plan? Are they aware of what you got? And are they ready to help you? And this was a new guide that I wasn't aware of. There's a new ASTM, it's not new, it's actually 4 years old now. There's an ASTM standard for coordinating cooperation between facilities, LEPCs, and other emergency responders. And it's a really good guide if you haven't taken a look at it yet. It basically just lays out expectations for each of those players. So what is a facility expected to provide? What is a local emergency planning committee expected to provide? What are emergency responders expected to do? And it outlines those expectations and sort of facilitates that coordination, so that although pretty much all of the players will have NIMS and will respond within that framework for incident command, this just kind of, again, provides that checklist of, okay, as a facility, I need to have a plan. I need to have this response equipment. I need to do whatever. And I will be able to fulfill that requirement so that I'm a good player within that game. So looking at all of that, there is a lot to think about with our facility response plans. And as I mentioned, some of this should be familiar to us. We're all familiar with having that hazard evaluation. We're all familiar with training our people and having people in place to be able to respond. Some of the training requirements are a little bit new for us, though. We may have fallen into an incidental spill response before, where this is kind of outlining that we need to be prepared for treating this as an emergency. And we all know that if it gets into water, anything that's going to affect that water quality is definitely an emergency. So looking at this anew and looking at ways that we can enhance our plans and include those bad weather days. And that's something that was kind of a new thing for us. It's always been intended, but just kind of refreshing that. So even if this plan doesn't necessarily apply to you, what are the things that we can do to enhance our plans so that when that bad day comes, we truly are ready? And again, I'd like to thank all of you for your time. And if we have any questions, I'd be glad to take those now.
Awesome. Thank you, Karen. Very well done. I know that there's a lot of information that was just given in that last hour. Karen, can you give a little more detail on what we'll be sending out after the fact to kind of help them digest that?
Yes. So after this, we will be sending you a link to the webinar, which you've just attended. We will also be sending you a link to an article that kind of outlines what we talked about today. So it will have all of those different regulatory links. So the link to the Clean Water Act hazardous substances, those 296 substances, a link to the National Contingency Plan, I saw one in the chat, the ASTM standard that is in there as well. So that is one that, of course, ASTM is a standard making body, so that's one that you'll probably have to pay for. It's about 5 pages long. It's not a super long one, but I did find some neat things in there that I hadn't really thought about before as a planner. Also, we'll have a checklist. So if you are a facility that does need to plan for this, it basically just breaks down all of those regulations so that you can check them off as you're creating your plan and know that you've covered what you need to cover within your facility response plan. And even if you don't, again, still great resource for enhancing any plans that you may already have.
Awesome. Gary asked, could municipalities be considered facilities that need this response plan, i.e. Wastewater plant?
If you are a wastewater plant that has one of those 296 chemicals in a threshold quantity, then yes, you would meet that definition. I don't remember anything in that list that a traditional wastewater facility has that is going to subject them to it. They're really kind of the more super nasty hazardous chemicals, where traditionally in wastewater treatment, those are things that we're putting into water all the time. So I don't remember anything on that list, but definitely check the list at 40 CFR 116 if you are treating your water with something out of the ordinary. Definitely worth a check, but I can't think of anything that is traditionally being used that is going to trigger this plan.
Mark had said, yes, I guess to answer your question, Mark, Karen, correct me if I'm wrong, we'll be sending out a link to the list of liquids.
Yes.
Correct. And Garrett, yes, there will be a checklist available that you can reference that will be sent out with all the additional information.
Yeah, there's a lot in this role.
Awesome. Well, if there's no further questions, again, thank you for attending, Karen. Thank you very much. Another wonderful webinar. If you do need anything, as I mentioned, we'll be sending out the link to get your certificate. I know that was a question above. If you do have any questions, feel free to reach out to myself or Karen, or you can just our generic sales at HalenHardy.com, and we'll be able to get you the answers. But thank you for attending, and hope to see you on our next one.